Give it a go. Just as long as nobody hurls insults or heckles me. I get enough of that. I get enough of that with Chironomid. Okay, well tonight we are going to focus on Chironomids. So now don't, if you're not I think a lot of people are stillwater. Yeah. If you're not, the same kind of things apply to rivers. Yeah, they are not beginner flies, but we'll try to make them easy.
You should be like a step ahead of Curtis at all times.
Pretty much, yeah. You'll know exactly what I'm tying before I get it on the hook. So this is a size 16. This is a Hannock 530. Sometimes I use the 333. Anyway, they're both kind of, depending on how you look at them, I'd call them emerger hooks, but I think they call them light check hooks.
Is it a 230 or a 333?
This one's probably the 333. I also use the 530 on these. They're really very, very similar. In fact, I think the 333 is slightly thicker gauge wire. So again, not a huge deal. So this, if you've seen a pattern I tie called the foam merger, it's a similar concept. I don't think, there is something about this Easy Magic Dub. It's basically a super micro chenille. When it gets wet, I think these fibers just kind of hold the water and it creates a translucent effect. I don't know, but any pattern that I fish that has this Easy Magic Dub in it is pretty killer. So anyway, this goes back when I started getting into Chironomids and stillwaters a lot more hardcore. For me, it was kind of a translation from river fishing and the traditional midges to obviously bigger bugs. A little bit difference in how they hatch and how they behave. So my foam merger, I would fish my foam merger quite a bit. And the foam merger, if you're not familiar with it, has a gray or black foam head and then one of these Easy Magic Dub extended bodies, and that's pretty much it. So what it does is it orients itself somewhat vertically in the surface film, and the trout take it for a trapped midge emerger. It's super effective. This time of year, hardly a day goes by in the shop where we don't have somebody coming in that had been fishing them out on the river. Anyway, so I'd been using those out on some stillwater and did really well. But then I started, sometimes I'll just set up either with my camera or whatever and just kind of monitor what the fish are doing. And a couple times, as I've noticed, as these Chironomids are hatching, these bigger, they're, maybe a size, let's say 14 on up to 12, 10. As they're hatching, I noticed that the breathers, the shuck part of the breathers, so they're actually not the breathers because the bugs are already emerged, were super, super white. And I started looking on the water and noticing, and I've seen this many times over, that you can really spot those shucks a mile away because of those breathers. And then one day I was kind of back in a little shallow, kind of stagnant part of the lake, and I started watching these bugs emerge. And the breathers are definitely a key. When I'd watched the fish feed, almost every instance when the bugs were at least at this phase, they were focusing on the ones that are partially in and out of the surface. So on this pattern, I've made it so that the breathers are very visible with the foam. I like that extended body. It could be a shuck, it could be the body. If you've watched midges or chironomids emerge. There's a lot, it's kind of a big buggy mess for a bit. It could also, size-wise, depending on what you're doing, it could imitate a mating midge cluster. But anyway, so that's the story behind that. And it's a relatively simple tie. So I'm just going to start and dress the whole hook about to the bend, or at least where the bend begins. These don't have a defined bend. And I'm going to tie in some Mirage tinsel. And this is it.
This with black thread?
Yeah, this is just black thread. And so the first part of this, I'm just laying down a shiny base. Now, pretty much every time I go out, I will take throat samples from a few fish, depending on what I'm doing. And I space it out during the day because I like to see where they're feeding, how the hatch is progressing on what they're feeding, and also from beginning of the season towards summer and into fall, how their diet changes and where they are feeding. So one of the really cool things is that I've noticed in early in the season, or at least early in the morning, if it's during the chironomid heavy time, the fish are going to be feeding often down deeper because the midges will start to pupate, and they're going to start as a red, black, or red olive, or a black olive kind of color, and they're dark as they start to pupate. And then they get closer to the surface, and I can tell this if I take a fish throat sample from a fish that I've caught in the top 3 or 4 feet, for sure it's mostly going to have silverish chironomid pupa in it. So what I'm doing with this is I'm going to create that silverish body. Again, this is somewhat of an kind of a representative pattern because they may not have all of these features at once. So the bug may hatch and it's got no more silver, but sometimes there are bugs that have begun to hatch and they do have silver. So I'm kind of trying to throw in as many trigger points as I can.
Is that small tinsel?
This one's medium. You can use small just the same. I would definitely use smaller if it were a smaller pattern. And that's the beauty of this. So if you're doing more still water, this is size 16, on up to 12 kind of thing. So they don't have to be super small. If you have noticed, and for some reason in Utah it's a little different, like if you talk to Brian Chan or Phil Rowley up in BC, they're like big, size 8s and 10s, or if you go to Pyramid, they've got really big ones. But a lot of the high mountain stuff that I fish, they're still pretty small. But bigger than a river still. So you'd be talking like 22s and 24s. And so this is just going to create a little bit of a body. And again, just to imitate that, I'm going to go at about a little over half way up and then tie that off. Okay, so now as you can kind of see on this, I've got the base underbody is the tinsel, and now I'm going to tie in my Easy Magic Dub. Now normally I'll just, depending on how small I'm getting, I may singe the end of these, but I didn't bring my lighter, so it doesn't matter. And I like to tie this in so that it's overlapped, so it goes beyond the bend or the end of the hook there by, I don't know, half a shank length. You don't want this to be super long. And then the one thing that happens with these, because it's a core material, is that if you tie it on there and then pull it tight, sometimes we'll flip to one side of the hook or the other. So I'll lash it on there pretty good and then make sure I've got the tension on so that it stays on the top of the hook. And then I'll just trim off the excess here. So that's, from my point of view, the tail looks way too long, but that's my angle. So anyway, Now I'm going to tie in what a lot of people don't realize is actually a really good dry fly material, and that's trigger point. So EP fibers, if you've heard, I'm sure you've all heard of EP fibers. It's the guy that makes EP, Enrico Puglisi. It's called trigger point, and the main difference between the two, they're essentially the same, is that trigger point is treated with like a watershed or something. So it floats super well, and I've been using this on wings for terrestrials, like this for midges or chironomids for the past couple, 3 years, and it's good stuff. So what I'll do is kind of take about hook eye width of materials, and this is going to serve two purposes. Number one, it'll kind of serve as our wing going over the back here, and I'm just going to tie that in longer because I'll trim it. Okay, so it's gonna be just that wing, and whether or not, again, the chironomid may not, the pupa may not have had its wings pop out yet, but again, we're trying to imitate as many little trigger points as possible. So we've got that on there, and then we're going to use the front of this to come off in front of our breathers, like so. So I'm going to leave that on there, and we'll just tie the other two materials right on top of it and then trim it when we're done. I'll trim it a little bit here, but I'll finalize that when I'm done tying it. So now the next material is going to be one of my favorite all-around dubbings, and that is ice dub. It's UV shrimp pink, and it's actually orange, but if you get in there, there's a lot of pink fibers. And so Lance Egan, who's our shop manager, his Frenchie's got this in it. There's a couple other patterns that we fish that has this shrimp pink in it, and I think it's a super Chironomid heavy color, because if you look at their wing buds when they're hatching, when they're pupating, they go from kind of a palish yellow, palish orange, all the way to more of a bright red, bright orange. But I think this color here represents the in-between kind of average of those. Plus, ice dub is a fish catcher just in general. So I'm going to take a little bit of this, just enough to give it a little bit of a thorax. And I don't want to overdub this too much, just enough to give me a couple of wraps. Little goes a long way. I'm going to make sure that I don't trap my trigger point fibers down any more than I have. Okay, and then the final little piece here is some white foam. Now this, so what I have here is Rainey's Evisote. It is, I'm not sure how it's made, but at the end of the day, this is a very, and I tried this on the foam merger, it's a great floating foam for small patterns. So if I'm going to throw a big terrestrial or some sort of big attractor pattern, I could use closed cell like crosslink or just craft foam, and it's not going to matter. It'll still float. It'll hold a ton of floatant. You can put deer hair on it. You could put trigger point or EP fibers, whatever. But when you're dealing with small patterns like this, you really need maximum flotation ability, and that's why I like the Evisote. Will it work with regular foam? Sure. But the thing is, with this pattern, you need to make sure you dress it so that only the trigger point and the foam are dressed if you're using float. Because you kind of want this back end to kick beneath the surface a bit. Sometimes you might not, and that's where with Chironomids it gets kind of tricky, because I've seen it where I can visibly see them taking bugs that are in the surface film and ignoring adults that are on the surface. And then, like a light switch, it'll swap. And they'll go from taking stuff in the surface film to stuff only on the surface. That's the beauty of this one, is once that happens, you could slap some floatant on the whole thing and you're good to go. So it is a nice little versatile pattern. So what I do here is I just cut a very small piece of foam, and this is, you don't have to round it or anything. I just use, kind of keep it in the same shape. This is about the cross section I'm looking at. Width-wise, about, let's say, the hook gap-ish. And I cut, because these are small, yeah, I cut this longer. And the way I do this, so I'm going to stick it on the hook parallel to the hook shank. This is easy. This is an easy way to get this tied on. And this same thing works with barbell eyes. It works with anything you need to lash perpendicular to your hook. Put it on parallel first, and I'll usually give it a couple of wraps like so. And then I'll come in here and twist it. And then once I twist it, I can come up behind and follow that tie-in point and just crimp it down like that. Okay, now I want to make sure I'm not trapping any more fibers than I have to. Not going to matter that much if you do, because midges have legs, so at the end of the day it's not a big deal. Now I'm going to preen everything back and come right in front underneath my EP, or the trigger point, and then I'm going to grab my little Midge whip finisher. These little Tiemco, this is the dual purpose. They're the Midge size, so you can see how big the head is on that. And so I'll pull the bobbin up and out of the way so that I can still use my thumb and index finger to grab. And then we simply throw a couple, 3 whip finishes in, tighten that up. Now we'll just come in here and cut her off. Okay, and then final thing again, you see I still got my trigger point coming out there. And I'm going to come in here and pull on you got to pull, I'm all fingers here. So I'm going to have to pull on the foam. And as I pull on foam, I'm just going to come in making sure I'm not cutting anything I shouldn't, and get close enough to it on each side. And what happens is when you put some tension on that and you release it after you cut it, it goes back and it kind of forms a nice little rounded shape. Like that. So it kind of looks like a jumbled buggy mess, but once you're dressing it, it'll sit on the surface film. And this is one of those situations where a lot of times you'll see guys scratching their heads because, if you're a hardcore stillwater guy, you probably don't have a floating line rigged up, which you obviously want to do in this case. And a lot of times on the water you'll see, especially during chironomid hatches, even though they're not taking anything on the surface, you'll still see that porpoise fin rise. And again, most of the time it's going to trend, it will go from that phase to actually surface takes. So even though, anyway, my point is a lot of times as a stillwater guy, you're going to get conditioned to the fact that the fish are not taking dries or not taking something on the surface or in the surface. But as I've done this more and more, I realize that I'm probably not catching them on the surface because I haven't been fishing anything on the surface or right in the surface film. I've even had a few times where I could get fish that I know, if I know there's chironomids around, this is a big enough, and I can actually see it, it's a big enough attractor that I can get some fish to come up and take. So most of the time when I'm fishing chironomids, I'll have a dry fly rod on the boat so that I can throw a dry if I want. Anywho, any questions on that?
Does your black material, does it stay stiff or does it?
No, that's a great question. It does stay pretty stiff. It doesn't. There's no movement in it to speak of, and that's kind of the thing that my Fomerger, which is very similar to this, was made so that it would hang in the water somewhat vertically. It's not going to be exactly vertical, but okay. But absolutely, I think if you're really getting serious about chironomids, you got to have some bright green in the mix. So I messed around with some different colors. Again, compared to stuff that I had, in my tie-in supplies.
So would you tie this in chartreuse? Fluorescent chartreuse?
Yeah. So this color here, the thread is fluorescent chartreuse.
Oh.
Yeah, the Uniflex that I'm going to use is chartreuse, but you could use anything that's bright green. I think it needs to have a little bit of the brightness. They're not just a plain green. They're definitely a chartreuse fluorescent kind of hue. So, well, the other thing too with chironomids, one thing, and I didn't bring my other box, but here's a good example. If you can kind of see. So you see in my box, I'm just starting this box right here. I've got the top row weighted, second row weighted, third row not weighted. So for the most part, I will vary the weights of my chironomids, both by color and style. So this one I'm going to tie here is a little bit heavier version of, sharp hook there, a little bit heavier version of the same one that I may tie with a smaller bead. So this is going to be one that if I'm finding the fish are closer to the bottom and I need to get it down quicker, that's what I'll do. Which also goes to the idea of why I use probably more of a midge tip or hover line as opposed to a sinking line. Midge tip line is a floating line with a 6 or 12 foot, it's an intermediate kind of slow sinking section. So it's that tip section, it will sink at like an inch a second or less. I can't remember the rate. But the nice thing is that you can cast it out, and I'll use a long leader, like a 15 to 20 foot leader with 3 flies. And the flies will be spaced 4 to 6 feet apart. So I've got a heavier one on the point. The 2 droppers, the first dropper may be a bead. The top dropper will be unweighted. That way I can fish the water column. You know, if I'm fishing even 20 feet of water, this happened at Strawberry in the fall, we were marking fish at 20 feet, and our midge tip wasn't going to get down 20 feet. But what we found was we would let it get down, and we were picking off the fish that were in 10 feet of water, even though the majority of the fish we were marked were at 20. So, but I wouldn't have gotten that if I'd had like an indicator, because an indicator gets me a set depth of maybe 2 or 3 feet apart. But this one, the midge tip will separate your flies out, and you can control the depth based on the fly. So I'll have like some of the next one I'm going to tie after this one is it's my deep pattern, and it's this dark red black one. So this is kind of the phase right after they're starting to pupate from their blood worm phase. And I'll get that heavy, so if I need on that midge tip line, that'll be on the point. That'll get everything down to the bottom. And I can be, you know, again, depending on the length of the leader and the setup of the flies, I can kind of gauge where I'm fishing. So if the fish are in the top 2 feet of the water column, then what I'll do is I'll trim off any weighted flies and fish 2 unweighted flies. And that way I'm fishing in this water column. And literally with 1 fly change, I can be back down to 10 feet. And that way I don't have to switch lines. For chironomids, I probably fish 80% of the time with a midge tip. Used to use indicators a lot more. I found that indicators, I'm missing so many fish. So, not saying that they're not good, I'm just saying that I prefer this method. But anyway, enough blather. If I really wanted to weight this, I could add some lead or lead-free wire. So, this one, and this is a style, and then the next one I tie will be a similar kind of style. But probably my favorite style is sometimes called a span flex buzzer, a flex buzzer, a gray boy is another name they use in the UK. And it really just consists of thread, or in this case some hollow tinsel, and Uniflex. Believe me, I go through this almost every year, but I try all the different body materials and I do experiments on what looks the best. In my opinion, Uniflex is the most versatile. It looks the best when you're done. It looks like the most realistic segmentation. It's also super cheap for 15 yards. This stuff will last quite a while. And again, you could use Spanflex, you could use Legs Alive from Fly Tires Dungeon. What other names? Sexy Floss. Brian Chan and Phil Rowley have another one they used to sell. Something, Chironomid something, I don't know. Anyway, it's the same. It's a spandex material, really stretchy. So this is a style I use, probably my favorite style for tying Chironomid patterns, because you can mix it up. Here's the thing, the other, let's call it a secret to Chironomids, is Chironomids come in a lot of different colors. If you look at the naturals, the colors are, there's a large segment and then the small segments. So if you've seen something like a chromie or a zebra midge, the large segment would be what the thread is showing, and then the small segment would be the wire. So if you look at the naturals around, you're going to see the large segment, so the combinations would be, you may see black large segment, red small segment, silver large segment, red small segment, olive or green large segment, silver small segment, olive or green large and small, red large and small, olive, brown. So I try to keep actually have a list in my notes that I keep track of so I don't forget which the color combinations there. So in other words, you're not going to find a Chironomid that I've seen that has red large segment and black small segment so much. It may look that way. Or you may, it just depends on the phase of the bug. And I've found that makes a difference. If you're fishing higher in the water column and they're pupating close to the surface, they're going to be really silver. They may have some red, but they may also have some black in there, so that'll be the small segment. Anyway, enough nerding out on Chironomid colors. So what I do to tie this in, and that kind of the thing with Chironomids is they are fairly skinny along the main part of the body. So I don't like to tie in, like you've seen, a lot of times you'll tie in a material and then have it go the length of the body. I don't like to do that just because this adds bulk that I don't need. So here's a trick that I use. I'll rein my thread in a little, and I'll take a wrap and then position my material right on the top. So it's right on the top. I've done 2 wraps, holding it tight. I'm going to come in here and do 2 locking wraps. So that's locked in there. Now I'm going to come in here, and you can use your fingers if you want. Pull that up. Using sharp scissors, trim it. So now you can see I can start wrapping that with very minimal bulk on that end. Chironomids are tapered.
Could you use chartreuse midge tubing instead of a uniform?
Yeah, you could use that. Chartreuse mid tubing would work well. I have messed around with the midge tubing. I've messed around with D-rib. D-rib also works well. I like D-rib more for the consistent uniform colors, but it'll work just as well. There's a lot of things you can use for bodies. It's not a magic material, but I do like the way this looks. So now I'm going to grab some holographic tinsel in small. You could use sulky. You could also use Flashaboo. Flashaboo is the same mylar material. And I think it's, with a lot of my Chironomids, I like to have red because there's a lot of hemoglobin going on there. So I'll just use my touching turns on up to about the hook point. Now I'm going to grab my hollow tinsel and just wrap. You can wrap solid or you can segment it however you want to do. But again, if you're looking at the naturals, you will notice some red segments in almost any color Chironomid. There's going to be pupas, at least. Going to be some vestiges of red. Obviously bloodworms, kind of where all that begins. But they will have these leftover colors in them. And then, and it's important, I like to cover the hook as well as I can. I'm going to go on up. And on any Chironomid that I tie, I'll use kind of the same thing where I build up a taper. Usually up and back a couple times, and that will create the taper for me. we can just trim off our excess here. Okay, so that's the body. And with my Uniflex, the first couple wraps I'm going to do fairly tightly because I want that to be thin, but I need to leave a little bit of room for that segment to show through. And then after the third or fourth wrap, I'm going to go ahead and release the tension and let it just wrap. Again, they're almost touching, but you need to leave a little bit of space so that the underbody can show through. All the way on up to my thorax. We'll just trap that. Throw a couple locks in front. And pull. Cut it. Okay. So now I've got my body tied up. We can see some of the hemoglobin shining through there. And now we're going to coat it. So what I've got here is some Loon UV clear fly finish. Just a note on UV products, if you've messed around with different ones, you know, there's Clear Cure Goo that was around for a while, now they went out of business. Loon and Solarez and Deer Creek, probably the top 3 out there that you'll find. Loon, we work with Loon quite a bit across testing materials, or not materials, but products and tools. They're the only one that's actually tested for toxicity and other nasties that you could get by touching this. So I use that quite a bit. I do like Solarez a lot. They've actually been around longer than anybody. And their stuff is really, really good. I can't stand Deer Creek because it smells horrible. But anyway, and it comes in different viscosities. This is the fluorescing stuff, and I'll show you what that means in a second when I shine my light on it. But just a little, this is the thinnest that you can get. It's tack-free once it cures. And this is by no means any scientific claim. But I've had in the last 2 years since this has been out, I've had probably 3 times where I've been fishing right next to Cheech usually, and I'm roping fish and he's not catching anything. Now that's not new, but in a couple cases, I mean, we're literally within casting distance of each other using the same kind of Chironomids, and the only difference in the couple cases that we had was I had used this and he had used no UV finish, or maybe a different kind. I was talking to the Loon guys about this. They did some field testing with some saltwater guys who would use these on deceivers or clousers, I can't remember which. And they'd given some out to guys that didn't know what they were tied with. Some were finished with this and some not. And the guys that came back that had these, again, they didn't know, they caught a lot more. It was a marked difference. So the theory is that it has some UV reflectance properties, and there's a mixed agreement on whether or not fish can see reflected UV wavelengths of light. I don't know, I'm not a scientist. I do know that I use this on a lot of my patterns. I like it a lot, and I think it has made a difference. So this is the one I use when I'm going to use UV that's thin like this. So what I'll normally do is apply a small thin coat. I'm not trying to coat the entire pattern with a big clump, although I would like it to come out of the bottle. Last night I was getting a little chummy with the light.
Are you using flow or fin?
So this is the equivalent of flow.
Okay.
It's the UV, the fluorescing UV clear. So it's the viscosity of flow. It just has the UV stuff to it.
I had issues with the tips clogging up like that until I just started storing it upside down. And then it's always wet and never clogs.
Yeah, and the funny thing is on the way over, it actually tipped over and had a little leakage in the thing, but we'll get it to come out eventually.
Don't tie with it outside.
Yeah, you don't want to tie with it outside.
But once.
Yeah, you're not going to do too many. I'm going to live on the edge here. Okay.
So my Beavis stencil shows right through this green chartreuse, almost no matter how loose I wrap it.
And that's fine. You using tinsel underbody?
Tinsel underbody, but I tried to wrap it without any tension, and it's darker, but it's still not.
Yeah, and it will. This specific combination is a little different in that respect, so I wouldn't worry about it. So as I fear, I got a little too much, so we're going to do it.
I'm using chartreuse tubing and it's a bit too transparent.
Yeah, that's what my problem is.
If I had to say what the importance factor is, wouldn't worry about the translucence or the overall color. If you got the segmentation and it's a brighter green like this, I think you're golden. I'm going to stick this over here. And now see how that just pops? That basically is irresistible to fish. They can't resist it, literally. Anyway, it's a getter. It's a fish getter. And the final thing I'm going to add here, believe it or not, is some UV shrimp pink eye stuff. Too much on there. Oh, and I forgot an important aspect. Forgot the breathers. So one little note, I forgot to put the breathers on, but actually, let's see here. Nope, we're stuck. So normally what I'll do is I'll take parapost wing material, and I've used a lot of different options for breathers. My theory on breathers with Chironomids says, like I explained on the last fly, it needs to be very visible. So if you use something like CDC or maybe even a non-treated Antron or something, I don't think they show up as well as this parapost. So I use parapost in white, and usually before I tie anything on the fly, I'll tie the breathers in, and I'll just show you what that looks like. So here's a smaller fly, but so I'll tie those breathers in first.
In front of the bead?
In front of the bead, yeah. So I'll tie the breathers in. You got to minimize your wraps, especially on the smaller sizes, so that the bead doesn't, or the bead's able to sit or be seated on the top, on the front there. But I think, you know, if you've probably heard of the ice cream cone pattern. I just think breathers are a really key component. So I'll use them quite a bit, not in every pattern. Okay, so there is the finished fly. So now if you've seen some of my Instagram or Facebook photos on Chironomids, a lot of times I'll tie in the wing pads. Honestly, sometimes I don't think it really matters because not all of them have visible wing pads. But in the case of the shrimp pink, like I said, I think it is a good representation, and I tie it in the round, meaning the trout looks at it, it's going to say, well, it's a wing pad, doesn't know that there's not one on the other side, or doesn't know that it goes all the way around. So, you know, again, if I'm tying flies for, well, here's a good example. You know, if I'm thinking the fish are going to be a little pickier, I'll tie in something like this that's going to have that wing pad in there, really slimmed down. This is for a fish that's just being super techie picky. And so this is more kind of the absolute match the hatch. This guy's more of an imitative attractor. It's still going to catch a lot of fish. And that's another reason why I'll fish a team of 2 to 3 flies when I'm doing chironomids. Because usually you got to dial in the depth and you got to dial in the color, well, and the size. But if you're fishing a good average size, I don't think that's as big a deal. If you can dial in where they're feeding and the color they're feeding on, the majority, you're golden. And if you've ever fished with Lance Egan, I mean, that guy, number one, he's world famous for his Euro nymphing, but the dude can catch fish on still water like nobody I've ever seen. So a lot of my approach has kind of been honed by being outfished by him whenever we go. And he's kind of the same approach where he'll have some that are super weighted, some that are not so much. But it's really just about getting it down to where the fish are and then making sure you've got a color that they'll eat. And so that's kind of what that is. Yeah, so your strawberry early season, this would be killer. Places where you're fishing in maybe less than 15 feet, 10, 15 feet. You start on the bottom and kind of work your way up. Okay. So this last one is, so here's my approach. When I get to like if I'm going to go out, I do a lot of fishing out at Six Lakes and Falcons Ledge in the spring because they ice off a lot sooner in the high mountains. And in the spring, that's when the bloodworms become active. And what they'll do, this is according to Phil Rowley, I've not seen it myself, but I've seen the effect of it, is that the larvae will come out of their homes in the mud and the gunk, and they'll move locations. So when they do that, obviously that's dinner bell for the fish. So if I'm going to early spring, strawberries, another place that you'll do this at, like if you go in on the west side of Strawberry Bay Marina, so like the actual bay, and you get back in there, it's a little bit shallower and it's muddy. That is killer chironomid action out in that area. So right after ice off, those bloodworms will be active. So the first thing I'll try to do when I'm fishing these areas is go deep. Fish close to the bottom, a foot or less from the bottom. And I'll fish either bloodworms or I'll fish darker bloodworm into pupa patterns. So that's what this one is.
Size 10?
This will be a size 10, yeah. So the size is going to be a 2.8 millimeter bead. And so this is this is what I'm going after here. It is basically for when it's starting to turn from a bloodworm into a pupa. And so it's dark, there's not too much silver in it. So I'll lay a little bit of a red tinsel body, and then I'll use that same Uniflex method for the ribbing. And then on this one I will add wing pads and no breathers. And this row, at least here that I've tied up, has .015 lead wire behind the bead. And part of the reason I don't use breathers or any other appendage is this is one I want to sink fast. So if I want a fly that sinks fast, I don't tie anything else on it. Pure materials that I can resin over and a bead, and it will just, boom, plummet. So that's what I'm going after here. Is this one that I can go out early in the season, or if it's early in the day, I can fish it a lot deeper. It'll sink super fast and still look good and catch fish. So,
Do you want your bead to be black necessarily?
I do like it to be black. If you look at the naturals, all of their thorax areas are going to be black, with few exceptions. And there's that taper factor. The only thing that I may add to something like this one, and my other box I've got them all segmented out better, would be breathers, but we're not going to mess around with breathers. In fact, you probably don't need wing pads for this one, but I'll tie them in because I think it's a good technique to show you. So this is just black thread. You could probably use 140 denier if you wanted. I just use 70. With most of my chironomids, actually all of my chironomids, I'm using UTC because I can flatten it. If you're ever doing like quill bodies or wire bodies or anything that needs to have solid segmentation right on top of the thread, or even, you want to use a thread that can lay flat. And you probably can't see, yeah, you can see it. You see how it's twisted? I just barely tied on, the hook shank length, and it's already twisted. So you give that a counterclockwise spin until you can see it start to untwist. And also, as an added bonus, when you untwist it and it's laid flat, you can tie in your materials easier. So if you think about it, think of a rope that's twisted tightly and then trying to lash something onto a bar versus a flat webbing. What would be easier to wrap that and cinch it down? This is going to be something that's wider. Same method here with the Uniflex. This is black. Another one that I'll use is they've got purple, and then I'll also use their, I want to say it's a claret color. It's a dark, oh, actually brown. It is brown. To me, it looks a little reddish, rust, but those are the darker colors that I'll use for this style of pattern. So it's the same technique. I just tie that right on the top, 2 tight wraps, and then a couple, 3 locking wraps, and then I just come in here, pull it, and put it on. And then in this case, I'm going to grab hollow tinsel large, because the one disadvantage to large is a little bit harder to wrap, so you have to yank it.
It is.
Now I'll get back to the end and then just work my way forward.
So would you use brown or purple flexi floss on this?
This one's black flexi floss.
If you didn't have black and you had purple?
I'd use purple or brown, yep. Anything dark. Without fail, when I take samples from fish that I've caught on the bottom or near the bottom, they've either got bloodworms or they're got the darker color tint to them. Oh, and another interesting one that I've seen, I don't know who here has ever fished Matt Warner, but that lake is like Chironomid heaven. And there are a lot of pink. So they'll go from a darker red to almost a pink before they get silver when they pupate. So I do really well up there with pink. All right. So I even got kind of nerdy one time, and I took a lot of samples and I measured their thorax width and the end of their abdomen, and then I created a ratio against the length of their body. And I can't remember the number, but almost regardless of size, it was the same ratio. In other words, the taper. So the width of the butt section versus the thorax is about the same, regardless of the size and type. So that's why I always create a taper on my chironomids.
So you've got red tinsel and flexi floss tied.
Yep, that's it.
And
So
that's
now,
the large red tinsel, right?
yeah, just again for me, if I hold it tight, I can cover more ground in fewer wraps. That's the thing with the large, you got to do a little bit of overlap so that you don't get little kinks that pop up. And I just wrap this right on up to just before the bead, because this is, we're not going to tie in any thorax of dubbing or anything. And then it's the same drill with the Flexi or the Uniflex. The first couple are going to be tight wraps, and then I just let the rotary kick in. See, like on this one, this one wanting to slide on me, so I just go over it until I get the right tension. And then by the time I'm at the thorax, there's like no tension on this. And you got to make sure you catch that good. So there's the body. So you notice the segments there, it kind of shows the red through. The nice thing is when you start to add a little bit of the resin, it'll sink down in and fill that the void between the wraps, and it actually makes it look more natural. So I probably could have gotten a little tighter on my wraps there, but not a huge deal. Okay, so on this one, I'm going to add actually add the resin at the end, because we're not going to do dubbing. And so now what I've got here is some orange or sunburst colored biots. And I will grab two, and I'll strip them off one at a time. Like so. And now if you go on YouTube or see instructional videos on chironomids, you'll see people tie these in 100 different ways. So there's nothing magical about the way I do it. I do it this way because I think it's easiest. So I'm going to hold the two biots between my thumb and forefinger, and I'm going to split the hook there, and then I'm going to switch hands. And so you'll notice now I've got these pointing, the hook's upside down, and I'm going to be right where my wraps left off. And what I'll do is I'm going to come up here and grab one soft wrap, and as you do that, the torque will carry those two pieces of those two biots together and form a V. See that? You don't really even have to try. As soon as you put that thread wrap on there, those biots want to suck up into that V shape. And so then, once I've got those in there, I'm going to come in and finish up the thorax. You don't want to get too close to the V before you cut this off, but it does help to have super sharp scissors. And trim those off, and then I can finish covering this. Okay, so we've got our Chironomid wing buds tied in, and then what I'll do here is I just push them both forward, grab them with my other hand. Now there's some patterns, I have got a couple on our YouTube channel, where I'm actually pulling the bead, I'm pushing the bead back, and I'll pull these up and around the bead so that they'll create those wing pads around the bead. Like it actually looks more natural that way. But in this case, I'm not going to worry about that because I'm not going to tie them off in front. So what I'll do is I'll do a somewhat soft wrap and then another one tighten down, pulling kind of towards the bead. And then that just leaves those two there. And then with biots, if you've done a decent job and you hold it tight, you should be able to just tear that off. And you don't want to undo the wrap, so keep the tension on it, and you'll do the same on the other side. And then to conserve wraps, we'll just throw our wet finish in right here. Nice thing about finishing with the resin, you don't have to finish the heck out of it because it'll be all finished off with the resin. And so again, these are just little hot spots, little trigger for the fish. Most of the chironomids that you see are going to have wing pads. So now I'm going to come in with my resin. More than enough there. And I always have a resin bodkin. And we'll just finish that out and just kind of keeping the taper, and I just coat the whole thing. Now this has a really runny consistency, so if you're going to coat the whole thing and you kind of apportion it out here, you need to be quick with the light or keep it moving at least. And then we'll just zap it. And that's it. These are nice because I'm tying these to be quick to tie, but also quick to drop. And once you notice, once the resin's in there, it looks a lot more realistic. And the fish will eat it up. That's it. Okay, any questions on chironomids that I may not have answered?
So on this, it looked like you put the bead on backwards. So
You know,
small hole.
I might have, and it was not intentional.
Okay, so you want the bead on normal.
Yeah, I still do it that way. In
Yeah.
fact, yeah, I think you're right. This one was hard to tell, but yeah, it's definitely on backwards.
But you do want the bead on normal.
I usually, yeah, I put the bead on.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
If you do them with like breathers out the front, do you find an advantage of having the bead on in reverse versus normal?
No, I can, in fact, I probably like it more because it will seat. So when you tie in the breathers and you've got that tie-in point, if you tied it in backwards, the bead I think would go too far up the breathers. Whereas if you're tying on right, the smaller hole in front, like I should have done there, but I couldn't because I couldn't see, I would have, that can kind of stop right at the point where I tied the breathers in and they still remain splayed out like they should.